I want to talk about the topic of nudging, and particularly I want to talk about nudging with respect to carbon footprints of our diets. So it's very much a consumer-focused talk that we will have now in the role of being a consumer. Now, when we look into nudging, before I want to talk about what actually nudging is and what we want to nudge, the most urgent question is actually the why we actually want to intervene in the consumer market for any reason. And it's a question that we have not consistently asked in nudging research, folks. There's quite some research on refusing plastic bags at the checkout counter in the supermarket, which we cannot really consider a high impact behavior in terms of the environmental gains that we get from that. So first we have to define, there are basically 5 more or less key areas of what you can do to improve the carbon footprint of our diet. First one, and that one is known to some degree, although often not to the degree of just how different their carbon footprint is plant-based products and animal-based products. And that's also a topic where we see increasing variance, that some consume more meat, others consume less, and this gap is actually widening. And there's quite some contribution we can have if we select more plant-based products in our daily diet. Another topic that's not so transparent in retail is air-fried products. Another topic then is sometimes you can find some indication on it in labeling indoor farming, and others would be heated greenhouses. And we have the topic of food losses that Roberto will also talk about from the farm side. That's also a topic from the consumer side, especially if there are animal products involved again. But even for the plant-based products, that's a topic with quite some high saving potential. And we have the way that we shop. Now, I will not go into much detail and why these are key areas, but just very brief for the first one, because I will continue to talk about it. Here I have a graph for you where you have on the y-axis, you have the relative impact of a number of food categories. And on the x-axis, we have actually the amount consumed within Germany now by FAO data. So you can see that cereals is from all food products, food categories that we have the most consumed one, which isn't surprising. However, the bubble, which is the whole CO2 emissions associated with the production of that food group along the value chain, that of course is largest for what are the animal-based products, beef, cheese, and pork. And that's something we can find quite consistently and to a strong degree, despite this, that they are consumed less than the plant-based ones. Now you can go into more details on that. But in general, what I wanted to talk about is that we have the chance actually to have more or less a 1-ton diet. And that's kind of the goal that we want to nudge people towards. That's something vegans achieve, but flexitarians can also easily achieve that if they focus a bit, or if they're enabled to focus on these kind of 5 key areas. So let us zoom in a bit on this target behavior, or what we actually want to nudge. So when we talk about plant-based products that we want more, then we make daily choices about the kind of foods that we choose, whether the kind of meals that we like, and some of them certainly have meat in it. So how do we actually want to substitute it? And this substitution question can be solved in different ways. One option is we simply reduce the quantity of the meat in the meal. That's an approach that is quite popular actually in Asia, especially in Japan. You can see that meat mostly has the function of being a flavor component. Hardly energy or calories are derived from the meat in the meals. That is one option. You can also look at the very evolving technical substitutions where they try to mimic meat with soy texturing or pea-based texturing approaches. That's another option that's quite easy to implement for some. And there's another option that's also pretty well established, especially among vegetarians and vegans. And these are rather authentic vegetarian dishes. That's what we would call it, with a lot of pulses, and they also have some kind of functionality similar to meat. They provide proteins and so on, but they do not try to mimic meat. So now if you look at our food environments, one thing is sure, the best way to convince people to substitute is to offer all options to them, because certainly there's heterogeneity, and some might like to reduce meat, some might find it more okay to go with the processed meat substitutes or the meat alternatives, all kinds of preference in the market. However, especially in the supermarket, you might still find some of it, but in the out-of-home consumption, which is usually about 1/3 of the food market, the options are rather limited. The providers or the restaurants and so on, they have to prioritize certain meals. So not always or rarely all options are available. So a more concrete example for that, also one from a recent registered report that I did, where we looked at at 3 dishes. One of them was spaghetti, and we wanted to check how okay people would be or consumers would be with actually substituting the beef bolognese that usually goes with it. And then you can offer them a reduced meat portion size. You can offer them a full reduction of the meat component, having a tomato sauce. You can offer them the soy-based alternative, the textured one. You can offer them a lentil bolognese. And there we also want to find out just how accepting consumers are of these alternatives, and especially what kind of consumers can be influenced in that way with certain kind of substitution options. So now that we know what we want to do, we want to help people substituting, then we can talk about nudging as one of many tools, but it's a particularly interesting tool, in my opinion, to help people doing that. The basic idea is to make better options easier. And better is always depends on your definition, of course. So in that sense, here we could say better is meals with a lower climate impact or a lower carbon footprint. So what nudging actually does is that it influences the food environment, the kind of environments that our decisions happen in. It can be the purchase environment, but it can also be the environment in which we receive information on food purchases, on potential food purchases. Here, an example of that is grapes. In the Scandinavian supermarket, they had grapes in the fruit in the food area. They took them out of this area, put them next to the cheese in the supermarket, and sales of grapes went up. That's kind of how you can structure the choice, that you can change the way that certain options are offered to consumers. And that, of course, has an effect on their likelihood of purchasing them. Important is the promise that comes with the nudging definition, that we don't want to restrict the freedom of choices. So all options need to stay available at the same economic costs. So there should not be higher prices, and there should not be higher cost of deselecting a certain product that is offered to you. So yeah, the grape example is a choice structuring one, but there's also something that is much older than the whole nudging research, and that's actually choice describing, where we talk about labeling, about choice, about claims that we make on products, all kinds of information that kind of influence the way we perceive certain options when we go and purchase them. So yeah, and one thing is important to keep in mind there, why nudging is particularly interesting for the food domain, because when we buy a tractor or a car, then we do that like, 4 times in a lifetime. So these are rather reflected choices, and also it's quite important choices for us economically, each one of them. So we will be really rational. We will try to be fully informed about all options and about all the attributes of the options available to us. That's not the case when we have food purchases. There's just too many of them that we do. About 2/3 of them are rather habitual. 1/3 are then also spontaneous impulsive purchases. Some of them are also really reflected in the sense that we go out with the shopping list. But that's kind of the margin there. And when we look into other research, they also showed how many decisions people feel they do on a daily basis. Then it's just like 15, and when you give them certain decisions that they actually did, then they can actually agree that about 200 of them they did on a regular day. This, of course, depends on how you define a food choice in that sense. Looking at 2 examples, when we look into choice describing, we will see that labeling, especially when we talk about the carbon footprint, it's kind of a hardly regulated, quite wild field. we can see that policy has rarely gotten involved, but there are, of course, some multinational companies, processors, also some retailers that have started initiatives and have started to label their products. But they do it, of course, in the way that is best for them, and rightfully so, because they use it to have a USP in the end. But these different ways that they present, like reduction labels here, 71% reduction compared to any reference that you choose, or carbon neutral label, where you basically pay off into another scheme to compensate for the CO2 emissions associated with your production. They don't really inform the consumer on what a climate-friendly diet is. So in the end, they don't really help to consumers to find a way to lower their carbon footprint of their diet. And they have other limitations, that these compensation schemes, they are not unlimited. And we have problems sometimes with the reference group. An example, for example, from Ala Foods, they had a milk product where on the package they had this reduction claim, and in the fine print it was written that this reduction claim applies only to the packaging material, not to the milk. So there's a lot of potential for problems coming with that if there's no unique way of how we label it. And in the end, of course, we want to help consumers. So we need to find a good way to label our products in a way that consumers can actually benefit from them, and that they're not more confused than they already are with all the labels already existing in the market. We have also written a short piece on that, what could actually be a way forward. And going into choice structuring, I want to present to you a rather big project from the north of Belgium. That's the so-called Donderdag Veggiedag initiative. And the way to perceive it is, although that's not the full story, is to look into a school, and you have caterers that offer lunch menus for these schools. And in the traditional way was always they had a normal meal, which would be something like rice, meatballs, normal dish with meat. And then parents or the kids could write a letter or call to deselect and to opt out into a vegetarian dish. So 2% of them did so. So now on the Thursday, what they actually did is they reversed the whole story. So the vegetarian dish was the normal version, and everybody who did not like it had to call or write a letter to deselect into the meat menu. And of course, much more vegetarian meals were sold on a Thursday than on the other days. So normal, in a sense, is actually already a strong nudge. The other experiments in that way that we plan, like for example, having a lunch menu where we put climate-friendly dishes on a lunch menu on the table, while not restricting the options of consumers by telling them there is a full menu available that they can also choose from. But maybe just because it's more convenient, some of them get influenced to choose the climate-friendly ones already presented on the table. So some key things that I want to stress for nudging are so-called undesirable nudges. And that's how I named the term. It's not well described so far, but the idea is that we have lots of nudges. Before we actually look into nudges that we can create to improve our diet, I think we should look into the nudges that actually worsen our diet in terms of environmental indicators. And this Donderdag Veggiedag is one example, because if we would have an active choice where we would ask consumers, do you want a vegetarian or the meat dish? Then you would end up with something between of what we have seen of the Thursdays versus the other days. But because of the way the setup, the nudges that are in place, we sell more meat dishes than we need to. And that's something we see often with our food environments. And that's something I think that should be addressed first. There are other examples that I could go on and on about, like the checkout counter that helps with impulsive purchases of sweets. That's another option, problem from the health perspective. And there are more about how whole grain products are not usually available in out-of-home markets, and so on and so on. The other point is that with taxes, we sometimes have the problem that it adversely affects the poorest consumers. And we see that CO2 tax, for example, we claim that, yeah, in terms of energy consumption, we can see a higher income usually means more energy consumption, means they would be more affected by a CO2 tax. However, with food choices and CO2 impact of their food choices, that's not really correlated with income. So here you would actually adversely affect poor consumers with the CO2 tax. And that's a bit different for nudges, because if you have strong preferences for one dish, the options are not restricted. The nudges are unlikely to influence you then if you have this strong preference. So the adaptation costs are lower. And that can be an advantage in that sense for vulnerable groups. However, at the moment, we have to say it's not about looking for effective nudges. We know that they are effective, but it's looking into what are actually legitimate nudges. And one problem that we have, for example, is consumer autonomy. We have seen nudges, no doubt, that actually limit this freedom of choice. And that's something that actually breaks the promise that the definition of nudges give, and also runs the risk of overshooting with the policy. And that's something we really don't want to do. There are other risks in terms of welfare that we can adversely affect vulnerable groups, that sometimes retailers, for example, can be adversely affected by policy, and then they have strong legal grounds to actually oppose a certain nudging policy. However, all in all, I've also done a bit of research on that and can talk more about it, is that it's not always a linear relationship. The less legitimate, the more successful is a nudge. That can be the case depending on a key feature that you use, but very often it is not. And we actually can have more legitimate nudges, and that's the current goal, by not harming our nudge success. But that's also a bit of a bright outlook, in my opinion, on how nudges can contribute us and help us to a more climate-friendly diet. Yeah, thanks a lot for the attention.